Well, in the first case, if you really wanted to get a fight going between two Irishmen, there should have been bourbon. That's just the first point. So that when you do this again, make sure you set the right conditions. And I guarantee you, you would get what you wanted. Thank you very much for the invitation to come up here. I've been here now about 2 hours, and where do I sign up and how do I stay? It's absolutely beautiful up here, and thank you so much for the invitation to come up here. And it's wonderful to see so many friends, some former students, one there and one here, Domers and Hoyas. I've been on the road quite a lot. The reception of the book has been as surprising to me as it was to Yale University Press, which sold out all of its copies in the first week. It's been extremely interesting. Most gratifying for me is that even though these are things that we've been writing about in Front Porch Republic and a number of other venues, American Conservative, for many years, that to the extent that I might be a carrier of some of these concerns and arguments, I'm honored and extremely gratified. But I'm also really, really looking forward to going home. And this will be the first, when I have one more talk, this is interesting. I'm speaking with Ross Douthat tomorrow, and then on Monday night I have a conversation with David Brooks. So I'm running through the New York Times editorial page. And after that event, I'll be going home. And the thing I'm really looking forward to is something I get to do every spring, which is to crack open my compost that I've been putting all of our leavings from our meals over the course of the year, and to see the miracle of new humus that I really don't have to do much to create. That simply by throwing in what we think of as waste into this box out in our backyard, I get to re-fertilize our garden, and I'm really looking forward. As we were leaving here tonight, I saw the starter plants that'll be planted probably this weekend, I was told, and I'm really looking forward to at least spending a little time in my garden. And every year when I do this, as I suspect you do here as well, it strikes me the profundity of the creation of soil as a kind of, in a way you could say, not an insubstantial symbol of what a healthy society is as well. That taking, in some ways, what is left over or what is extra, and creating from what we might think of as waste or extra, something that we use to re-fertilize the soil and to renew it, is a symbol of a good and healthy society. And I suspect that's part of what I'm already seeing here in these couple of hours that I've been here. A place that not only literally, I assume, creates soil and humus for its gardens, but also tends to that challenging task of cultivating culture, of always renewing culture. And that it's not something that happens automatically. It requires tending and attention and care, and a willingness year after year always to renew and to be attentive to also what is lost. I can't help but think of that in many ways. A good civilization is basically organized effort to fight entropy. I think that's what good farming is in lots of ways. That entropy is, of course, in the second law of thermodynamics, right? Organized forms of energy tend to dissipate unless you try to restrain that dissipation of energy. And a good farmer tries to resist entropy. And I would say a good society tries to resist entropy, tries to keep energy in an organized form. And that's what I'm doing when I'm making my soil and putting it back into my garden. I think it is then in some ways a kind of a useful symbol for what a good society and a good culture is. And in the book that I wrote, Why Liberalism Failed, in one sense, I don't talk about it explicitly in these terms, but in one sense what I suggest is that the society organized around the idea, the basic insight, or perhaps the ambition, that the purpose and end of human life is the liberation of the individual from all of the things that confine or limit the individual. And we can think of that in terms of things like place. Being born into a particular place is a limitation on my liberty. And so you organize a society that makes exit from place very easy. Indeed, it makes it almost required. My students that I've taught over 20 years at Princeton and Georgetown and Notre Dame, all will be living somewhere and many other places from where they grew up. In most cases, I always make the joke, you'll all be living in one of 5 cities in the world when you graduate from here. And I once had a student raise his hand and say, what are the other 2? It's true. We could say that it's a form of organization, a political order that not only in some ways is a political order, but creates a kind of social order in which the liberation of the individual from place, and of course also from culture or tradition, is one of its organizing features and principles. The liberty of the individual can't be achieved until and again we create as low a barrier to exit from a culture or a tradition as possible, so that one's inheritance in some ways comes to be seen as in some ways a limitation or a burden rather than a gift and a treasure to be kept. The gift of one's parents, what one's parents have learned, what previous generations have learned, becomes a kind of a weight upon one rather than a kind of gift toward one. And what kind of society then, rather than giving an inheritance, gives its children debt? Rather than giving them something, gives them less than something. That's a society that really has lost the understanding of what it is to be an inheritor and someone who passes on, a steward. And perhaps most deeply we could say a society that orients itself toward the liberation of the individual is one that will think of family as also as a kind of burden and a limitation on one's liberty. And will also seek to create conditions to lower as much as possible the obstacles to exit from marriage, from children, from having children, and even raising children, if that proves to be a burden to one. Indeed, making it possible to eliminate the children that one doesn't want to have, as our society seems so deeply committed to doing as a fundamental principle. This is a society, then, it seems to me, is one that has resisted, or let's put it this way, no longer cares to resist the forces of entropy, and that everything dissipates in this society. Everything moves toward dissolution. And we could say this is true in the natural world. How we treat the natural world, I think probably unlike how the natural world is treated here, is one in which entropy is constantly released. And we are therefore constantly dealing with the kind of predictable consequences of a world in which the uncontrolled release of energy is causing us to have great difficulties continuing our lives. And we talk about global warming today as this big problem, and what will we do to fix it? We will develop the technology that will allow us to fix it. Because it has nothing to do with how we've organized our society. The latest is that we can seed the atmosphere with small particles that will reflect back the sunlight. Now, nothing will go wrong with this plan, I suspect. And so we draw down on these kinds of resources and these inheritances that ought to be stewarded for future generations, because part of what it is to be liberated as the free and self-making self is to use what is there for yourself and for your own generation. But we do the same in a liberal society at the level of culture, at the level of a kind of cultural inheritance. We draw down on whatever cultural inheritance we might have had, and we turn it into a consumer product, ultimately. We turn it into something that is like a fashion dress that you can purchase in a store and then put back on the rack when you've decided it no longer is particularly becoming or desirable. We're living then, it seems to me, in a society ordered around the idea of the dissipation and the dissolution of forms, both from the natural world and from, we could say, the cultural world, that define and confine the release of entropic forces. And now we find ourselves in a situation in which increasingly we have the inability to hold things together, to hold together a society based on some conception of a common good oriented in particular toward the idea of inheritance from one generation to the next. Indeed, I think what we see today is a kind of war between the generations, an outright war between the young and the old, who no longer understand each other and can no longer speak to each other. So I wrote this book and have been writing about these ideas over many years in the hopes that we understand that our problem is not at its deepest level narrowly political. It's not winning this election or that election. It's a problem of, in a sense, a way of life, how we organize our society, but more deeply, how we think of ourselves as human beings, the kind of creatures that we are, and that we are not ultimately and fundamentally self-making selves. We are rather creatures, created as part of an order, connected to each other in and through that order, and ought to have a disposition of gratitude toward what we have been given and a sense of obligation to what we must give in turn. And here being with you this weekend, I think in a context in which this is so deeply understood and lived, is and ought to serve as a kind of, seems to me, an instructive counterexample to the world that we've constructed beyond these fields. And so I'm here, I hope, to learn as much as I might be able to convey anything. And I just want to thank you again for having me here this weekend.
Thank you for the invitation. I've been reading Plough with great avidity, and I'm delighted to be sharing the stage with my friend Patrick Deneen. I come from the other end of the state, in Genesee County, which is one of the 4 New York counties with more cows than people. 4 New York counties. I actually had a rather more than kin but less than kind joke here, but it's so lame that I dare not use it lest I lose you. Edmund Wilson, the splenetic sage of Talcottville up near Utica, once said that those of us out in God's country to the west of Syracuse, quote, seem very low grade, not even pretty girls, but pale, gray-eyed, lean, ill-built Polish women and the usual thick, loutish men. One wonders how these men and women can feel enough mutual attraction even to breed more of their unattractive kind, end quote. Well, we do, though. I had to go to California to find a spouse. By the way, if you've ever seen a photo of Edmund Wilson, you know, pot, meet kettle. I've been asked to speak on the Empire versus Our Town, not Thornton Wilder's play, though it too is Empire's enemy. I recall several years back when the depressed, suicidal, unfunny monologist Spalding Gray starred as the stage manager in a Lincoln Center revival of Our Town. The poster featured an image of the Earth as seen from space under the words, Our Town. Ha ha. Grover's Corner, New Hampshire is not visible in that photo. Neither is my town or yours. That was the point. It was a universalism divorced from all particularity. Senator William Fulbright, the only good politician named Bill ever to come from Arkansas, averred that, quote, the price of empire is America's soul, and that price is too high, end quote. The price can be measured in 1,001 non-metaphysical ways, too. For instance, 27 years and 2 months ago, I sat in Rochester's War Memorial Auditorium watching the Wyoming Indians, the smallest basketball-playing school in Section 5, contend for the Class D championship. Now, ever since the first point guard had dribbled out of the primeval ooze, Wyoming had dwelt in the basketball cellar. The team had never before come close to a sectional title. What made this game wrenchingly poignant was that it was also Wyoming's swan song. Wyoming High School was to be snuffed 3 months hence, a victim of onerous state education mandates. Virtually all of Wyoming fit into one patch of the cavernous war memorial. There were proud parents, craggy old-timers, little brothers and sisters struck dumb by the size of the arena. Hand-scrawled banners bore such legends as, Wyoming High will never die. But of course it would. The team won a thrilling game. The players and townspeople embraced on the playing floor, sobbing without shame. and then it was over. The following fall, Wyoming high school's 56 students would be tuitioned out to neighboring schools. They got those school vouchers, which make the dull hearts of Beltway conservatives flutter. So instead of walking to their final brick building, which admittedly lacked the state-required complement of computers, they could ride buses for an hour each way. The consolidation, the murder of rural schools, and the communities they served began as a project of progressive educators in the early years of the 20th century, but achieved its most destructive force at the dawn of the Cold War. We lost many tens of thousands of rural schools during the consolidation craze, which was spurred on by that high priest of Cold War pedagogy, James Bryant Conan, the Harvard University president, who had spent the First World War in the Chemical Warfare Service and the Second working on the atom bomb, devising ever more grisly ways of killing people he had never met, before he turned his malevolent attentions upon the nation's school children. Conan the Barbarian, in a series of well-funded and highly publicized reports, front page of Time, demanded the closing of all high schools with fewer than 400 students because of the urgency posed by the threat posed by the Soviet Union. American slackers and their quasi-anarchic system of local education were being outpaced by grim little Ivan Sputnik. Many of these schools were closed over the passionate objections of parents and the citizens of these small communities. I've written about this in my worst seller with good intentions. Though decades later, education researchers found that small high schools of under 400 students seemed to get the best results. Alas, it was too late. Many of those small schools were long gone, domestic casualties of the Cold War. I do like it when the elements of a unified field theory align. Years ago, I spent a morning with Joe Paterno, the Penn State football coach. I saw nothing, I assure you. I asked Coach Paterno why the once sterling quality of high school football in the western Pennsylvania coal country had deteriorated in recent years. He looked at me and said, "School consolidation." Thank you, Joe. The peremptory demands of empire alter our lives in ways both gross and subtle, seemingly innocuous and malign. Daylight saving time, which used to be called wartime, was a World War I innovation that eventually became permanent. Henceforth, the time of day was whatever we said it was, sun be damned. The metric system, which is permeating American life, despite widespread opposition from ordinary people, which is to say people who do not matter in American politics, is a project primarily of that unholy alliance of big science, big business, and big government, which coalesced during the Cold War. We have been hectored for 5 decades now to cut off our feet and submit to the meter. As though with the snap of a finger, the crack of a whip, the empire can make people adopt an entirely new system of measurement. When our daughter was in school, we told her to miss questions about metric measurements on purpose. To hell with a leader. Then again, we also told her to insist that Pluto was a planet. That explains those lousy science grades, I think. It's up to you not to heed the call-up. I could borrow from Edwin Starr and title my remarks, War, What Is It Good For? But then you'd fear that you were in for a cold shower of sanctimony, annoying and cloying, like those "war is not healthy for children and other living things" bumper stickers that used to drive Mother Teresa to want to napalm a nursery of Vietnamese babies. That one went too far, Bill. I'm sorry. I write to amuse myself. War is good for some things. Prosthetic limb manufacturers, the moving van industry, funeral parlors located near military bases. It is also, in my favorite Hunchback Randolph Bourne's aphorism, the health of the state, the essence and engine of big government, shredding liberties, feeding young men and now young women into the charnel house. Stephen Crane of Red Badge of Courage fame said that the unacknowledged part of war was, quote, the great country back of the line of fight, the waiting women, the lightless windows, the table set for 3 instead of 5, end quote. The home front. This is the side of war that is most real for ordinary Americans, yet which seldom interests our politicians or even our artists, except for singular patriots like Harold Frederick or Michael Cimino. War in a militarized state efface and pervert everything that traditionalist conservatives profess. War forcibly uproots people. It alters courtship patterns. It spreads venereal disease, if not democracy. It separates husbands from wives and parents from children. It always leads to a spike in the divorce rate among service personnel. Because while absence may make the heart grow fonder, love's truest expression is fixity. And war consigns the offspring of soldiers to government daycare. In fact, such daycare was the spawn of war, born as the Lanham Act of 1940, which subsidized over 3,000 daycare centers to incarcerate Rosie the Riveter's neglected kids. You know, I hate all that Rosie the Riveter crap. As if women working 10-hour days in a bomb factory making weapons of mass destruction while their children are tended by government employees in daycare was some sort of quantum leap forward for womankind. Down with Rosie the Riveter, up with Dorothy Day. The Army today is the single biggest daycare provider in the land of the semi-free. Over 200,000 American tykes are being raised in military daycare centers, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And what the Pentagon, with its usual tone deafness to Orwellian rings, calls the total Army family. No agency of the federal government has done as much to subvert the American family as has the Department of Defense. For sheer obscenity, it's hard to beat separating mothers from children, then sending those mothers across the world to assist in the taking of life. At church services or public gatherings in my town, a prayer for our young neighbors in the armed services will usually end with, "Bring them home safely." I never have the heart to tell folks that the architects of U.S. foreign policy do not intend for these soldiers to come home en masse, ever. They will be over there, from Europe to the Middle East, forever. It's no coincidence that the slogan most reviled by the foreign policy establishment, after America First, of course, was "Come Home, America," the patriot George McGovern's beautiful, even poetic plea in 1972. Because America ain't ever supposed to come home. Yet McGovern's call resonates still. Opinion polls show little enthusiasm for the rash of U.S. interventions on the other side of the globe. This is the isolationism that haunts the bloodless dreams of the war makers. An isolationist, as far as I can tell, is someone who wants neither to kill nor be killed by foreigners. In the mid-1950s, the largest public works project in American history, the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways, was sold as a national defense measure, just as was the first large-scale federal intervention in American education, the National Defense Education Act of 1958. The interstate would scar our lovely country, bisect and trisect, and destroy countless city neighborhoods, encourage the scattering of the population, and serve as a massive subsidy to the trucking industry, to chain stores, thus warring upon small-town main streets. It was a federal government project that changed American life in many ways, yet the creation of the Interstate and Defense Highway System was never once discussed in the pages of National Review, flagship publication of the Cold War right. Because the right had lost sight of America, it became obsessed with communism, and so this very un-American ideology of anti-communism came to dominate the right. The Warsaw Pact mattered. Warsaw, New York, and Warsaw, Illinois did not. But of course the internet, or the interstate rather, like the internet, and the space program, and Beyonce, is a symbol of American greatness. No man actually is without his petty hypocrisies. I drove largely on the interstate to get here today. I love and often quote G.K. Chesterton's line that a patriot never under any circumstances boasts of the largeness of his country, but always and of necessity boasts of the smallness of it. It's not a hard and fast rule, but the launchers of and propagandists for American wars and American empire have tended to be men without local loyalties, little loyalties, men who would never think to boast of the smallness of their country. USA, USA. No. More like Ever Batavia, Sweet Home Alabama, straight out of Compton, 4th of July, Asbury Park. Lincoln Colker, the main novelist, saw his country as losing itself as it stood astride the globe. If America was everywhere, then it would be nowhere. To Colker, home was Searsport, Maine, and his encomium upon it might stand as the creed of the whole little American tradition. Quote, "It's not a bad place, much like many others, but the secret of our love for it lies in this. We know it intimately. This is the lesson I get from Thoreau. Love your own pond. All are beautiful. Be contented where you are. Content, a lost word in our America. This restless ambition, I cannot feel the truth of it. I cannot follow there." End quote. Lacking restless ambition, loving your own pond, being content. What a stark contrast to the reigning idea of success in America. Consider a pair of colloquialisms. He'll go far, approving elders say of promising youngsters, the assumption being that success can be measured in terms of the distance one has traveled from home. If, on the other hand, we say of a boy, he's not going anywhere, we're not praising him for his steadfast loyalty, but damning him as an ambitionless sluggard. Those who stay loyal to their little postage stamps of ground are said to be losers. To abandon it, to trash it, to forget it, that's the freeway to American success. We are expected to look away, to prize the distant over the near at hand, to care more about Hollywood than Hudson, or Baghdad more than our own backyards. So what is to be done? Booker T. Washington said, "Cast down your buckets where you are," which is what, as I understand, the Bruderhof have done here in the aptly named Walden. The late novelist Norman Mailer, who said that he was to the left of the liberals and to the right of the conservatives, wisdom's place, diagnosed the modern malady. Quote, "The style of New York life has shifted since the Second World War, along with the rest of American cities, from a scene of local neighborhoods and personalities to a large, dull, impersonal style of life, which deadens us with its architecture, its highways, its abstract welfare, and its bureaucratic reflex to look for government solutions which come into the city from without and do not work. Our authority has been handed over to the federal power. We expect our economic solutions, our habitats, yes, even our entertainments, to derive from that remote abstract power, remote as the other end of a television tube. We are like wards in an orphan asylum. The shaping of the style of our lives is removed from us. We pay for huge military adventures and social experiments so separated from our direct control that we do not even know where to begin to criticize the lack of our power to criticize. Our condition is spiritless. We wait for abstract and personal powers to save us. We despise the abstractness of those powers. We loathe ourselves for our own apathy," end quote. And Mailer, by the way, was considered a joke in that race, in his mayoral candidacy. The cure is a revival of local life, of self-government, of citizenship. Mailer himself pointed the way home in one of the few truly creative and sensible political campaigns of the imperial age, his 1969 candidacy for mayor of New York City, which was based in love and loyalty, essential motives of any movement, any decent movement. Mailer wanted New York City to break off from New York State and form the 51st state. And then he wanted to devolve almost all power within the new state to the neighborhoods of the 5 boroughs, which would also be free to secede, correcting the mistake of 1898. that is Brooklyn's absorption into the soulless blob known as the city of Greater New York. The adjective greater, in referring to political entities, means in practice lesser. Now, the word secession sets off alarms at the thought police station because a previous secession was largely for the ignoble purpose of protecting slavery. But the principle itself is as American as Sandlot baseball, hard cider, and runaway slaves. For more on this, you might consult my book, Bye-Bye Miss American Empire, A History of American Secessions. Mailer called for a hip coalition of the left and right, for everything from black power to Irish self-righteousness. I'm running against urban renewal, he exclaimed in Jane Jacobsian language, which is to say he was on the side of beauty, poetry, sentiment, history, losers. His secondary plans, for instance, holding a World Series of stickball to be played in the lanes of Wall Street, shone with a luster that not even his running mate for city council president, Jimmy Breslin, could appreciate. Breslin did get off one of the campaign's best lines, however, when after Election Day he said, "I am mortified to have taken part in a process that required bars to be closed." Mailer's campaign was not an amusingly picturesque sidelight, but was rather part of a rich tradition of American dissent, of visions of alternative Americas that runs through the anti-federalists, the local focos, the populists, the distributists and Catholic workers, the old right, the prairie power participatory democracy wing of the new left. And it is in this room today and in this place, peace, place, they belong together. Thanks for listening.
Look, what strikes me is I had thought that I might spend a little time talking about the project that Bill and I were party of launching. I think it was 2009, a website and sort of online journal called Front Porch Republic. But Susanna strong-armed me into talking about what is liberalism, so I guess that's what I had to do. But what strikes me about listening to Bill is the sort of stunning simultaneity of the growth of the military-industrial complex, particularly the state and economy. In other words, the massification of life, the increasing collectivization of life, the standardization and homogenization of life, the consolidation of so many of the localities. So on the one hand, a kind of engorgement of America, and at the same time, the growth of this kind of radical individualism that I was speaking of. That these two things, far from being opposites, as we often think about in our politics, far from being opposites, in fact, grew up in really fundamental ways together. And I would offer as no better piece of evidence for this my street, the street I live on, which I think is one of the most fascinating streets in America, as everyone should think their streets
Absolutely.
are.
Patrick is content.
I am deeply content, but my street also causes me a great deal of discontent. For the following reason, the street that I live on was built, half of it was built before the Great Depression. And then when the Great Depression hit, they stopped building. And they started again after World War II, when the nation was flush again. And I live on the side of the street, or the half of the street, where the houses were built before the Great Depression. And the striking thing about my half of the street is that basically every house, embarrassingly except for mine, has a front porch. Has a front porch on it. We live in a Tudor brick house, so you got to take what you can get. The other thing about this side of the street is no one ever sells their houses, because once you get one of these, you hang on to it like grim death. And when we were thinking about the name, really was Bill's work, and the title of one of your books, right, was subtitle of one of your books was Front Porch Republic, was really about a kind of America in which the default was to build a front porch on that thing of what we think of as our private place, the place where we retreat to a sort of what Christopher Lasch called the haven in the heartless world. That place of privacy and family and retreat from the world nevertheless would have this building element as a natural default aspect, which was the space that acted as the intermediary space, or that median space between the private and the public realm. And that it wasn't something that one debated or thought about. It was simply something that one did. In the first instance, because it comported with nature. This was before the invention and even after the invention of air conditioning, and so it was where you would go for a cool breeze in the evening and to spend some time in both the shade but also outdoors. And it was also, of course, the space where you would go when, in a sense, you would say, I'm available to seeing my neighbors, but I retain the right whether to ask you up or not. You can pass by, or maybe we'll have an iced tea together, or possibly at some point a bourbon. But that this was a space that really acted as this intermediary space between the sort of one's neighbors and one's private realm. The building stopped with the Great Depression and began again after World War II. And in a way, at the beginning of this transformation of America. And what's striking is the other half of the street, there are no front porches. The entire building style changed. In fact, what those houses have are garages in the front. Our garages are in the back. So now the place of pride, in a sense, goes to the automobile. But all of these houses have back patios. So that the place you would go if you wanted to go outside was the place where you could no longer be seen by your neighbors, where you could, in a sense, attain a kind of a private space beyond the private space, with the house acting as a kind of barrier to the rest of the world. Think of the transformation of a society in which the default is the front porch to a society in which the default is the back patio. And I think you have, in a nutshell, a kind of transformation of the society, both in the broadest, the largest sense in which Bill talked about, and in the most intimate sense, that intimate space of the home that reflected these deep trends that we saw in broader society as well.
Yeah, Patrick actually wrote the first essay in the just published Front Porch Republic Manifesto, a terrific piece on the meaning of front porches. Air conditioning, by the way, was, I'm sorry to say, an invention of an upstate New Yorker, Mr. Carrier from Syracuse. You know the dome that is the Orangemen play? Actually, it's not called the Orangemen anymore. The orange, just a color. We have both the front porch. We have a front porch in our house, but the woman who owned it before us, who also named the home La Maison des Fleurs Printemps, and had a sign out front which we dug up the second we bought that thing. Total pariahs. Anyway, she put a back patio on, or deck, before moving to Southern California to find herself, Patrick, in the radical individualist stream that seems to flow westward.
One thing I'm curious about is how to cultivate that front porch hospitality and approachability at work, which is where many people spend so much of their day, and there are so few kind of on-ramps to generosity, and it seems like it would be one of the most striking, startling Christian things to in some way extend ourselves further, but I'm often startled about what that would even look like. What does a front porch look like at the office?
It kind of depends on your work and what the nature of your work is. What strikes me about, I'm talking tonight about a book that was published by Matt Crawford, familiar to many of you, Shop Class of Soulcraft, a number of years ago. If you haven't read it, get a copy and read it. It's a remarkable book. And what was really, I thought, terrific about Matt's book is, he kind of sold it as, I have a PhD in political philosophy, and I'm also a motorcycle repairman, so I've got cred. But when you read that book, what it was really about was that it turns out that the divide between sort of good work and bad work is not blue collar versus white collar, which is the way, certainly in those of us who work in the university world, the way in which we tend to think, that you're going to have good work if it's in an office. The divide between good work and bad work, as Matt laid it out, was the work in which, in a way, you know what you're doing when you do your work. You understand what your work is for, what its purpose is, to use the Aristotelian language, what its telos is, what its end is, versus work in which you are really just, putting a widget on a cog and sending it down the assembly line. And then it turns out that this kind of work is present both in the white-collar world. This is like what most of my students will be doing, and when they graduate in 2 weeks, and they'll be going off and becoming consultants. And I always ask them, what are you going to be doing as a consultant? And they say, I have no idea, but I'm going to spend the next 2 years doing it and make a lot of money. And so this is true in the white-collar world. This is true in the blue-collar world. If you work on an assembly line and you don't know what it is you're making, you're kind of doing repetitive motion things all day long, you're engaged also in a kind of form of bad work, as opposed to, he makes the argument, why being a motorcycle repairman is so great, because you have to use your mind to understand what it is you're doing from start to finish. I guess I would say that it's very hard to build a front porch republic in a workplace in which the work is bad, because in part it's designed to make people deracinated and, in a sense, ignorant not only of what they do, but ignorant of each other as well. This is why those of you, and there's probably no television on this compound, but those of you who know the film, the show Seinfeld, right? Whenever they show workplaces in Seinfeld, they're like the worst imaginable places, because these people have no idea what they're actually doing. I guess I would finally say that having been in a university environment much of my adult life now, I can say that I've experienced this in the university world as well, that there's good work and bad work in a university. And the interesting thing is that universities now define themselves essentially by what I would call bad work. That what you do is find your little tiny sliver of what it is you research, spend your entire life doing that, and talk to 3 or 4 other people who do the same thing. And that's what defines a successful academic today, is having those 3 or 4 other people who do what you do say that you're really good at doing what you do. And bad work is, in a sense, asking big questions where you have to talk to other people beyond the walls of your particular discipline. The interesting thing is that it turns out what we think of as parochial today, which is people who are hired in a university because they're going to form what you would call a collegium. They're going to be colleagues with each other, is the least parochial institution that one could imagine, because you have people speaking to each other in every possible disciplinary dialect and idiom and understanding. In other words, you understand that the work we're doing here aims at something finally comprehensive. It's a university. It aims at something universal. Whereas today's university is all fragments. It goes back to that idea of dissolution. It's completely fragmented. And so it's very hard then to have the proverbial version of the front porch in a place where people, in a sense, live in silos.
I have not worked in an office since I was 27, so I'm not really equipped to answer that. I did always found that alcohol was an excellent after-hours social lubricant. It enables one to, it actually gets to a related point. Patrick last night gave a terrific talk at the American Conservative 15th anniversary dinner, and one point he addressed is, there's this kind of rampant incivility now. People speaking past each other, people incapable of any kind of dialogue, and it's because I think they see each other in a unidimensional way. I know that I've seen people you might think would be, if you watch television, you think they'd be unable to communicate with each other or be in the same room with each other. I think of a born-again Christian woman and a gay woman who are involved in an organization, a civic group I'm involved in, and they are laboring together in the work of love and neighbors, and they come to know each other in a multidimensional way that I think is only possible on a small scale, and I think it's probably possible, a Bruderhof community scale. It's possible on the scale of my town. It's not, I think, possible at a larger scale where they would see each other, where it would be instead of Kim and Jane, it would be born again, nut and homo. It would just, they'd be unable to get past that. To see each other as rounded human beings. And it seems to be a scaling way down of all enterprises, including work is necessary are going to keep on talking past each other and caricaturing each other and demonizing each other. Oh, also, another thing I thought of while you were speaking, Patrick. Patrick has a great story, speaking of the university, about interviewing in a university in his hometown years ago. He was very excited about the prospect of working down the street from where he grew up.
Well, yes, we had young children at the time, and we thought how great it would be. It was a terrific little liberal arts college. I used to use the library and go to films on the campus as growing up. And I was so excited about the prospect of being there. Everyone I would talk to during my interview, I would tell how excited I was at the prospect of potentially teaching in the town that I grew up in, and that I would be so deeply devoted to this institution they would never be able to get rid of me. It turned out, I found out later, that my excitement about being home was held against me as a kind of a point that they thought I wasn't properly motivated for a job at this institution. They wanted somebody who was there because they were there because of the disciplinary excellence of the institution and its profile, et cetera, and not because of any kind of accidental geographic reason, which apparently was irrelevant to the consideration. And so eventually I ended up in Washington, D.C., so in the imperial city, of all things.